I get a chance to start off by introducing our speakers, saying just a little bit more about them. I think I'll start right here with Major General Richard Engel. He has been the Director of Environment and Natural Resources Program at the National Intelligence Council, which is where all of the sort of deep analysis takes place within the U.S. government. It's probably the most interesting part of the U.S. government, so we're lucky to have him here. He was, he's an Air Force General, and he was Commandant of the Industrial College of the Armed Forces and Commander of the Air Force Test Flight Center at Edwards Air Force Base. So we're delighted to have you here, General Engel. He's joined then by Amy Luers, and Amy Luers is here at the, she's Director of Climate Change at the Skoll Global Threats Fund, which you all know about. Before that, she was, and she also oversees the Water Initiative as well as the Climate Initiative there. She was Senior Environment Program Manager at Google prior to that, and Climate Program Manager for the California Office of the Union of Concerned Scientists. And many of you may know that organization. It's a nonprofit organization that does absolutely great work. And then the star of the hour, because he's the editor of the book that this is based on, is David Reed. He's Senior Vice President of for Policy at the World Wildlife Fund. And speaking of outstanding nonprofits, the World Wildlife Fund does really world-class work and has tremendous influence as it should. His most recent book, and going to be sort of our starting off point for this evening, is entitled In Pursuit of Prosperity, U.S. Foreign Policy in an Era of Natural Resource Scarcity. So I'm going to, David, just start off with you and basically have you say a word about why the title of your book. Are you kind of arguing on the one hand that we need a coherent strategy for prosperity? That would be a good thing to have. And on the other hand, and once we have one, shouldn't it be taking natural resources very much into account? So.
Great. First, it's a great honor to be here with you and the guests and indeed the audience tonight. So thank you very much for the opportunity. It's true, the title sort of indicates a pathway that we're going to follow as you read it, but it leaves very unclear, where's it going to drop us off? Where are we really headed with this book? No? So let me explain very briefly. Prosperity is something you never actually reach a final state. It's an ongoing process. And here we are trying to assure our prosperity in what I think is a radically new context, a radically new chapter in the human enterprise, a chapter that is characterized by scarcity, by not having, as we have assumed for so long, the free and available abundance of fresh water and forests and productive land and fish and mangroves and all these other assets that we have counted on. And when it says entering an era, this is quite a radical proposition. This is not a year or a decade. This is a totally new chapter in the human experience that we're preparing for. So then, how then do we respond to this? What does U.S. foreign policy have to do with this? The predicate of this book is that our prosperity, our national security, depends on the prosperity and the stability of our partners and our competitors around the world. And if their sustainability is under threat, likewise, our sustainability and our prosperity is under threat. And consequently, it is the burden, the responsibility of our foreign policy to address, to make sustainable natural resource management a central tenet of our foreign policy, which, unfortunately, it is truly not today.
So we put it in the give it the same privilege we give to national security or economic security we would give to just to you use a phrase that may not have that much meaning, but environmental security, environmental sustainability.
And that's correct.
Very much the same. But these are things, of course, that no one government can do alone. I mean, yes, should be integrated into our national policy, our foreign policy, but do we have the mechanisms for global governance, the mechanisms for shared management of resources?
Absolutely not, and it is very unlikely that we will have international treaties that will allow us to agree among all nations exactly how to manage these resources. But it is certainly our responsibility, as we have taken responsibility in many, many ways for the international community for more than a century. It is our responsibility to provide leadership, to demonstrate through our incentives, through our programs, through our partnerships, and through our political leadership, to say these really are areas that we need to be doing far more aggressively and much more comprehensively.
So I'm going to turn to you in a moment, Amy, to talk about the policy side, but also the role of the public. But let me just turn to you, because it's not for lack of knowledge that we're not acting and building the systems that we need. Tell me something about, as for how long the National Intelligence Council has been looking at these set of issues and treating them as important as other security concerns, but also the kinds of trends you've been seeing in your work.
Certainly. Let me first put a little context in terms of how we put natural resources and availability in national security. And this really started when we did our initial research looking at climate change about 2008. What we decided to do was say, how do we figure that is a national security issue? We looked at it from the point of view of what's going to challenge the U.S. elements of national power. That's our military power, our economic power, our geopolitical influence, or the social cohesion of the United States itself. And things that enhance that or degrade that are national security issues. That's a broad definition of national security. There's a shorter version of it, but for this type of topic, the broader one fits better. And then the question was, well, how are those elements of national power going to be affected by natural resources availability? And here, to build upon a point that David said, we kind of came to the conclusion through the climate work, and we've applied the same thing looking at food, water, energy, and minerals, that there's really kind of four mechanisms. One, it can directly impact the United States itself. Two, it can have an impact on a major U.S. military partner or economic partner in such a way that it consumes that partner so they can't work with us in a national security arena somewhere in the world. Three, it can damage valuable infrastructure. For example, the United States, as I said, could directly affect us. Or it can create a humanitarian crisis of such scope globally that the United States is compelled to respond. In that case, we end up actually consuming some of our military resources to respond. And we do that because that's a good thing for us to do as a society, but it does degrade at some level our national power. So following our look at climate change, which was kind of interesting, it was a look down, if you will, all the ways climate change could impact us, we came to the conclusion that that's happening because climate change is impacting food, it's impacting water, it's impacting energy development or economic development in countries, and also, I would say, creating changes in disease patterns and health. So we then decided to go back and say, instead of looking at the climate change down, let's look at these other topics this way and look at all the things that affect those. And we have, through a series of reports, looked at food, water, energy, and health. The water report, we did do an unclassified version of that and published that. We are finishing the food report now, and the food report will probably have an unclassified version published sometime next year, so it will come out. From the energy point of view, we've finished both the energy and the health ones. Energy and health we will probably cover publicly in reports that will either be in our Global Trends series that we do every 4 years, or it'll be something that we will suggest to the Director of National Intelligence he put in his annual threat assessment. And if you looked at his last annual threat assessment, he did cover energy, and he did cover food, water, and he did cover extreme weather as an example of climate change.
And is there an aspect of the threat assessments that is made public?
Yes, what I told you is on the unclassified version of the threat assessment.
And so, of course, a big part of your job is connecting the dots, right?
Yeah, they use that phrase a lot.
Among these issues.
Right.
And that, strikes me as key.
Well, that gets to the point of stability.
Exactly.
Because what we have seen, and I kind of alluded to this when I talked about the mechanism whereby if states become preoccupied, then they can't partner with us. But it can go even further than preoccupation. You can actually come to the point where a state's economic development can be stifled, which affects us because we're a major economic partner with it, or you can have instability. in the Middle East, some of what some analysts have attributed the Arab Spring, at least in part, to food price spikes and a variety of things that drove that instability. And of course, that affects the whole region, and it directly affects our security interests. So yes, these things go right to state stability.
And ongoing uncertainty about the social political impacts.
But the fascinating thing about it, and this is why we did this horizontally instead of just vertically with climate change, there's a lot of other factors that also play into these things over time. Demographics will be hugely challenging to these natural resources. Climate change will frustrate your ability to get the food, water, and energy, as you said. And then you have these other sitting challenges, environmental degradation that's taken place in a society. You have ethnic disagreements that are in a society, poor governance, corruption. All of those added on top of some of these spikes that can come from natural resource availability issues are just a catalyst for political instability.
Yeah. And if there is competition for resources, that will exacerbate ethnic differences or...
Absolutely, especially water. You can think about that in terms of farmers or people who have herds. You know, they have a conflict over water. You can have riparian disagreements over water between various states. Yes.
And also within. I mean, I think
yes,
one of the
within.
things the
Colorado
intelligence
River
community
we don't look at the
is...
United States.
Sorry?
I was making a joke about the Colorado River agreement.
So one of the things you worry about most is weak states, failing states,
Correct.
much more than strong states anymore.
For all those reasons I said.
For all those reasons you state. What about the problem of elites capturing the resources and thereby marginalizing others and exacerbating divisions within states?
Well, that manifests itself in several ways. If the extractive industry is managed for the benefit of elites and the populace as a whole doesn't see it, be that energy or be it minerals, then you end up with a state where the elite is separated from the people, and you're bound to get somewhere down the line, the people are going to stand up and rise and revolt to the elites. The other example where that's happening, I think, is in the case of food. In states where they don't have good land tenure arrangements and don't have good understanding of land rights, some land is being leased long-term or sold to other national entities or big corporate entities from other countries for growing food. And when you do that, you may displace farmers. And if they're not properly trained to go off and do other kinds of work, you set yourself up for instability because you displace people from land that they historically have lived on and worked on.
So Amy, we find ourselves basically on climate change and its many not just manifestations, but consequences. You've argued that among the approaches needs to be kind of community-led efforts. That's where standards are set, that's where behavior changes, that's where the impacts are felt. Talk a little bit about the role, particularly here, but also elsewhere, of philanthropy and of the citizen.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Let me start off by saying, with respect to this book, thank you and congratulations to you and your colleagues for pulling together a report and a book that really covers these issues of foreign policy, national security, and the environment in such a comprehensive way. And I urge everybody to read it, looking at this at a very macro level as well as a deep dive into some of these hotspot regions of the world. In terms of, there is one issue in terms of a broader framing that I wanted to flag and perhaps be a little bit provocative here, and that is that, I think that we often tend to, as a community, put all of the issues of the environment, global environmental change, into the bucket of resource scarcity. And I would like to suggest that resource scarcity, I think, is actually a rather limited framing in terms of thinking about the challenges that we face in the environment in the context of foreign policy, national security, global economic growth. And I will say, in the book, of course, you talk about a lot of things beyond resource scarcity, but I think that what I'd like to raise as a communication point of view is that as a framing, as a bucket under which we think about environment issues, we need to think beyond that. Now, certainly, if we think forward, rising population, increasing incomes of the middle class around the world is leading to exponential growth and demand of resources. And how we meet those in terms of food, water, energy, and other resources is a huge challenging task. And if how we do that sustainably will be a challenge we are going to be facing for the next many decades to come. But I would suggest that how we address those challenges is much less of an issue of resource scarcity than an issue of resource reliability. And what does that mean? I think that the issue that I'd like to put forward is that when we think about bucketing all these issues of environment, we need to start thinking about a larger challenge under which resource scarcity and resource reliability is just one component. And that challenge is that fundamentally, global society, humans, are changing the rules of the natural environment. We're changing the rules of the game under which foreign policy is played out, under which globalization is being played out. And it's those changing rules of the games that makes it so difficult for us in the foreign policy world. So the example, of course, one that has been brought up already this evening is climate change. This is the mega changing factor that's changing the rules in the game over all others, but not the only one. So we are, as we burn fossil fuels, as we deforest our landscapes, we are putting heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, which is rising temperatures, but it's also changing precipitation patterns and doing funky things with extreme weather that we still don't quite understand. And what does that mean? That means that the places that we traditionally have grown food in the traditional way we've grown food doesn't really work anymore. The places that we've built our cities doesn't necessarily work anymore. The way we've built our industry doesn't necessarily work anymore. And the relationship that we've made in the world to defend the structure that has been based on the old rules of the game doesn't really work anymore. And so when I think forward, what is the framing that we need to think about in terms of the global environmental changes? I really do think about that game. You know, chess is a game that we often think of as the model of how we think about strategy, or Go is a game I really liked when I was little. But let's take chess, because many people know the rules of those games more. You sit down to chess and you know, okay, a pawn can move 2 moves the first time, but only 1 every move after. The knight can move 2 forward and 1 to the left or 1 to the right. Now, if you sit down to a chess game, you don't decide, okay, why don't we have the rook, instead of moving straight this time, move in circles, right? And the reason people are good at this game is because they are strategic thinkers that have those rules given. It's part of the strategy they learn. Well, what we're doing right now in terms of changing the environment is changing the rules of the game. We're saying, okay, this time you play chess, you know that knight that usually goes 2 forward and 1 to the left or right? Well, this time the rule has changed. It goes 3 forwards and 1 only to the right. But it actually is worse than that, because what we're really saying is, actually all we know is that the rule for the knight has changed, but we're not exactly sure how. It could be that the rule for the knight is now 3 forward and 1 to the right, but it could also be that the new rule for that game is that the knight goes 2 back and 1 to the left. But we're not going to really know what that rule is for a few years. Good luck playing that game. And I think that is the structure in which I think about global environmental change, where resource scarcity is a part of it, but only one part of it.
So I would argue, and I'm going to get you go back to about nonprofits
question,
soon. Yes, you didn't. I'll get it. But isn't this what you're referring to, David, when you say we're entering a new era, a new epoch? In fact, that if we are in the process of changing the Earth's physiology, this is a fundamentally different period.
That's absolutely correct. And indeed, we do not know what the signposts of the future are moving forward. So I suggested we're moving down a path, but the book doesn't say where it's going to stop. In fact, as Amy suggests, we do not know what the signposts along that pathway are. The book, I think it's a very interesting discussion with Amy, and I really appreciate what you have said. Being in Washington has both advantages and disadvantages. in Washington, we find ourselves often compelled to try to find solutions and think what is a pragmatic policy response to this issue? Not that you don't think about solutions. Trust me, I know you do. But what we have found is today, in this context, profound political paralysis, and where half of our society is still in a framework of denying the significance, the impacts, the reality of climate change. What we are suggesting, and I think this has proven very helpful so far, is that the resource scarcity framework takes this fundamental change, this new episode, this new period of the human experience, and rather than taking it from putting it up in the 2050 climate models, and well, we can postpone doing something about it, and it brings it back to one's own backyard. It brings back to the scarcity in California, to the scarcity along the southern border, to the fact that the state of Georgia tried to change the borders with South Carolina in order to provide water resources for the city of Atlanta. I mean, it brings it back to a harshness and a reality that we cannot escape, and we cannot talk about in these grandiose terms. We have to find solutions. And so I think that's part of what we are trying to do in framing it as a resource scarcity, without denying the magnitude of change, but then trying to get it down so we can come up with responses that do not alienate half of our society, but actually pull people in and say, this threatens our prosperity, our well-being, our standard of living, and our sense of safety and security in this world.
You know, enlightened folks have been saying over a long time that we can't be secure in a world that's not secure, we can't be prosperous in a world that's not prosperous. We're feeling this, though, for the first time. I mean, that's the radical change. In theory, that was the case, but there was a sense that you could somehow wall yourself off from consequences elsewhere. Yeah. We're feeling that less today when we look at, I mean, just Ebola alone, right? The notion that vectors of disease, you know, a disease is a plane ride away, right? And this is not somebody else's problem but ours. I would argue, I mean, although I love your chess analysis, analogy mostly because I love chess, but I'd argue that our tools for analysis are still fundamentally sound. We're still in a position to provide the analysis. It's the strategy where we tend to fall down. We tend to fall, you know, I'll give you an example, David, that's in your book, in fact, where you point out that we defined our economic security within a foreign policy as making sure we got the minerals, et cetera, all the inputs for an industrial economy. Well, guess what? Our economy has fundamentally changed. So we're thinking about things differently. So it's the strategy that feels antiquated rather than the capacity for analysis. What would you say to that, General Engel?
Well, in some respects, I think the strategy question is one of trying to go back and define the problem. And from an intelligence community point of view, our look is narrowly focused on the security piece of it. So we consider the development part because the development part is critical to our national interest and to ourselves. In some respects, I'm really kind of optimistic about the longer term situation. But I really take the point from a strategy point of view. Business as usual will not work with what's in front of us. Okay, that is a given. The other thing I would agree with Amy on is I think what is uncertain in some areas specifically is how the climate will manifest itself. The way I put my engineer's hat on and I say, okay, this is an equation, has multiple factors, and there's a coefficient in front of one of these variables. I know the sign of the coefficient, but I don't really know exactly how big it is. You know, so I know what it's going to do, but I don't know how big it is. So going forward is hard. But that doesn't mean I don't do anything. I have to do something. And as I said, the business as usual approach will not really get us to where we need to be. The other huge unknown in terms of changing rules is technology. I mean, does anyone think we will have the same energy technology 50 years from now that we have today? Man, no way. Given the amount of money we have devoted to research in renewables, given the amount of money people are trying to think about clever, new, distributed ways of doing energy, I guarantee you our 50-year energy picture, we will not recognize it when we look back. So Those are very hard to predict, but you can't just sit on your hands. You have to deal with the cards that you've got right now, so you have to start making some decisions and make some strategy decisions as best you can with doing minimal damage near term, at the same time protecting your strategic interests. And that's the challenge for the policy community.
But back in the old days when we were worrying primarily about nuclear war prevention or other more traditional issues, you had a mammoth amount of uncertainty.
Absolutely.
And technology was a very significant factor.
Yep,
so
absolutely.
it isn't the first time the intelligence community has
No.
been able to play, I'd say, sort of multiple games of chess simultaneously. And it's the question of whether, Amy, back to you, whether the political system is prepared for dealing this kind of complexity and uncertainty. We don't know exactly what climate will do, right?
Yeah. I think that one of the challenges in terms of, you don't always even know the sign of the coefficient, right? I think that there are places,
in some cases we do,
there's some cases we do. I'm just saying, in some places, there's huge portions of the world where we don't even know it's getting drier and wetter, and you're trying to manage treaties about water treaties. It's a really huge challenge. So in terms of thinking forward and going to the recommendations at the end of the book, which I loved, and thinking about strategy, I think that there's one additional issue on strategy that I would add, which I think is very complementary, and I think that's the mindset. It's sort of how we think about these problems, and I would say that we need sort of, the way I would frame it is we need a foreign policy that is prepared for the age of renewables. So what do I mean by that? I think the infrastructure of our foreign policy network has been structured around, primarily, not completely, around extractive industries and around fossil fuel industries. And what does that look like? That looks like, nations which have, roll with me here, a bucket of resources which we need to go take from to feed our supply chains. And we have set up a foreign policy that is national leader to national leader that says, let's manage so that we are assured to be able to take those resources and feed our supply chain. Well, that world is changing, maybe not that rapidly, but it is changing. It's changing because those resources are becoming scarce. And it's also changing because the resources that are renewable, water, soils, food, land, forests, we're not treating as renewable. We're treating them as they're sitting in a bucket there for us to extract. And so that we're doing that not in a way that's managing their renewability, if you will, but rather just extracting them. And so we're coming up in the limits of that. Simultaneously, as was mentioned, there is a shift in terms of we're coming upon the infrastructure which has fueled our economies in terms of its energy is really shifting, not just from a technology, but from its structure, from a centralized to a decentralized approach. So what does this mean in terms of what does it mean for a foreign policy structure around in the age of renewables? I think it really means from a sort of one to few foreign policy to a networked system where, the core to sort of diplomacy today and historically has more been game theory, the decision process between one and a few. But what we really need to move is to network theory, to systems theory. We need to be able to think about the flows between all of the nodes in the networks that are actually supporting the systems that are supplying the goods and services of the renewable resources and enables the structure that allows for a distributed energy system, which we will be we will turn to eventually.
I should add that back in the old days when I was in government, the National Intelligence Council was looking at exactly those questions.
Right.
So,
multiple stages. I wanted to add one point about strategy. The intelligence community doesn't do policy prescription. We don't get in that business. We do try to identify for the national leadership opportunities that we think are available to the United States. And in preparing for our Global Trends series, we had Chatham House go off and do a really large report looking at natural resources for us. And it was fundamental, and it's on our website if you want to go look at it. But one of the things that kind of came out of that study that intrigued me was an idea of not only the systems decentralized approach, but a resilience. You do things with the point of view of resilience. Now, fortunately, decentralized internet nodal systems are almost inherently resilient at some level. That's a good thing. But if you think about the shocks we're trying to avoid, if I'm trying to avoid shocks to the food system or to any of the commodities that we have, then I have to have a commodity mechanism, the way I exchange goods and services, that is resilient, that allows me to take a hit in one area and keeps the system functioning. That is a legitimate issue for national leaderships to think about. And in some respects they have. I mean, we had the oil shocks and we had some additional energy shocks, and the G8 sat down, and we had food shocks. The G8 sat down and laid out some ways of trying to think about how they could mitigate the risk of food shocks. But we need to probably broaden that in some way and really think about resilience. Resilience to climate change specifically, but resilience to shocks that hit these systems.
So let me just ask you a question about shocks. Were we to experience, now I'm going to focus on the rich world, I'm going to focus on
In the developed world.
On OECD countries.
Okay.
Feeling less rich, huh?
No, that's fine.
But on OECD countries, and ask if we were collectively, Japan, Europe, us, to experience multiple Katrina-like events, 6 of them across those continents, what would be our capacity to respond, to cope, to rebound?
Well, what we would probably lose if we had that severe a hit would we lose the ability to mutually reinforce each other, which is obviously a big deal. If it really damaged energy infrastructure, fortunately Katrina was not devastating to energy infrastructure, but if you had multiple ones that really went after the energy infrastructure, then it would be pretty uncomfortable in terms of would it be a catastrophic blow? I don't think so, but it would certainly degrade our economic development, economic growth, and we would have economic impacts that would immediately affect us. One of the things that, from the United States point of view, if you had that, we have to have a resilient society, and we cannot have a bunch of Americans sitting in a Superdome trying to be taken care of. Right. That's not good for the social cohesion of the United States. Right. So I think that's an area where we have to be more resilient in protecting our own citizens. And I would hope we've learned all those lessons and we'll never see that again.
Gene, if I could comment, I think it's probably more probable, not that we will have our share of extreme events here, but I think it's much more probable that those extreme events will be in the developing world. And I think that indeed what we're seeing with ISIL, the Islamic State, the Middle East and so forth, I think is much more indicative of the kind of shocks, the Arab Spring, that one might consider being part of the new normal, that these kinds of disruptions will be true shocks to the food system. And we will see social dislocations, mass migration, magnified many times what is happening from Africa to Europe. And I think also looking particularly at the very vulnerable places, say in northern India, where you've already had, 20 million people without water moving to the cities, where the ability, or the Swat Valley in Pakistan, the inability to absorb the migration then becomes much more fertile ground for the ideological enticements, if you will, of extreme groups. So I think it's those, rather than the weather shocks themselves, it is this accumulative impact of resource scarcity with the climate impacts that are going to put societies in motion in uncontrollable ways that will have the major disruptive impacts on our own society. So
let's talk about some of what we're seeing now, or countries like China, they're worried about getting the resources they need, entering into large leases in Africa for minerals, for land, for food. What is the risk there that the decisions being taken by leaders in the host countries may produce a short-term economic benefit, may even produce a personal economic benefit, but not be in the long-term interests of their citizens? Are we seeing that? Is that something to be particularly alert to?
I think the land grab that Rich referred to in Madagascar, where the president agreed to lease 1/3 of the arable land to Daewoo, the Korean company, led to his downfall and his replacement to an uprising that replaced him. Well, you find similar relationships now between South Africa and the Congo, between the United Arab Emirates and different parts of the continent of Africa and so forth. These will be occurring.
And this is the Congo is for water? I mean,
it's actually for food. Actually, it's a very, very rich land that has no integrated communication system, transport system, but the South Africans then are very much interested in trying to help rebuild that infrastructure. So we will be seeing more of that, I think it's very certain.
So Amy, you're not going to be able to get away from questions about the role of citizens. And this, we've got a questioner who asks about, do you think the top-down system, decisions taken by central governments, is the most effective method of enacting and implementing environmental conservation policies? What is the role of NGOs, grassroots organizations, both domestically and internationally?
I mean, I think that, you know, in the same vein of talking about the need, it's the foreign policy for the age of renewables, if you will, or the coming age of renewables, I think this need to move towards a more systems-based, network-based approach to resource management and to foreign policy and to national security issues really does reach out beyond government to civil society and to the scientific community as well. I mean, I think that the scientific community, you know, we do focus increasingly on how can we co-develop knowledge with society, and I'm part of the Future Earth project, which is an international community of global sustainability research, which is very focused on restructuring the entire global sustainability research community in such a way that it can be co-designed to meet and be responsive to the needs of society. So I think that in terms of both monitoring and managing resources, we need a more distributed system. And I think that sort of the digital diplomacy world, I wonder what your thoughts on that are. But I think that the sort of that Hillary Clinton pushed is there will be a place for that in terms of the role of resource management. I think that, you know, we do have information that we have collected historically about our resources, but we need to change how that's done, because we need to look at them as a systems level. The resources that if we're going to manage the resources at a systems level, supply goods and services, we need to have information that's open and transparent about those resources across borders. And that's not always true. So civil society can play a role in that. The scientific community and technology can play a huge role.
Right. And you might want to say a word about technology. Here we've got extraordinary access to surveillance, et cetera.
Yes, we do. But in many cases, the best data available is the data that one state won't give to another state.
Exactly.
And I think the best example of that is in river basin water management. I mean, particularly the downstream states feel that the water is being consumed by the upstream states, and the stream measuring equipment that is upstream is not shared. That data is not shared with the downstream riparian state. And one of the things that makes a good water agreement is a very open exchange of information, so everyone knows how the water is being used and good ways of arbitrating disputes. So yes, sharing the data is just fascinating. And to the overhead systems and the other things, not necessarily the intelligence community. I think in the open science, people are trying to figure out, in the example of water, how they can estimate what the water flows are by using satellites. Exactly. Not, as I said, not the intelligence community, just broadly the scientific community. And that's cool. They pull that off. That's great. I mean, that will help answer some questions and avoid some people pointing fingers. Well, they'll still point fingers at them, but it makes the argument perhaps a little weaker. So
let me just broaden this, though, to include the private sector as well. They have to worry about supply chain management and ensuring that the supply chain isn't disrupted. They have to worry about stability just as much as states have to worry about stability of their partners, their customers, et cetera. I know that Business for Social Responsibility works a lot with with businesses to help them predict and foresee what the issues are going to be. David, are these, does the private sector have a significant role, positive role that it is playing right now?
One, it's very nice to hear you mention the Business for Social Responsibility. We met with them this afternoon, and one of the projects that we are carrying out is to follow up on, to help show the way of what does a new foreign policy look like, is doing an inventory of several dozen of the leading U.S. corporations, analyzing, learning from their sustainability practices. What are they doing? I know we talk with Levi's, we talk with Procter & Gamble, absolutely phenomenal innovation. Energy, water, the design of the final product, it is absolutely remarkable. The question then is, how do we collect their lessons, and how do we share them, and how do we translate their practices into what is called our commercial statecraft? That's to say, how does our government, through its bilateral investment treaties, its trade agreements, by EXIM, OPEC, and so forth, these other instruments, how do we share and provide incentives to encourage the expansion of these sustainability strategies? So from our point of view, it has to be a balance of policy reforms that we've talked about, but it fundamentally is going to be driven, and I think going to your point, Rich, about innovation, it's going to come from the private sector.
Right. So let me just, because several of the questions are sort of country specific, and actually we've got several on water, so let me get to them. One questioner points out that that the RLC has been drying out in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and that really stems from an economic development policy, right, of the former Soviet Union, I guess, to irrigate cotton. Say something about that problem, number one, but also this questioner wants to know whether Russia and successor states, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and others, have developed better policies since, economic development policies.
Would you like me to respond to that?
Yeah,
I hesitate only because I had a very interesting experience with the National Intelligence Council on this very issue about what could have been called the water wars in Central Asia, no? Yeah. And indeed, the policies that have pursued there under the Soviet Union have been catastrophic. They also balanced the water policy with energy policy, making sure that the upstream collectors of water were able to trade off and barter in exchange, providing water for energy that was provided during the winter years. An absolutely fascinating array, but that's shattered. It is shattered. And right now, the drawdown of water from the tributaries into the Aral Sea, as well as from the Aral Sea itself, are continuing. There's been no abatement of that drawdown of that asset. And with the breaking down of the Soviet Union and the imposed political solution, there has not been the basis for negotiating a sustainable and regenerative policy for the Aral Sea, 1/10 of its original size.
1/10.
Yeah.
David, did you want to, I mean, Richard, did you want to add anything?
I really don't want to comment on specific countries,
Okay.
although I think you covered that one quite well.
We're going to stay with water for a
That's
little
fine.
bit, because there are two questions, but this is, I have to put it in a country because the questioner put it in China and asked, well, we have two different ones. One says China is building the world's largest water diversion project. The grain is grown in the north and the water is not there. And this questioner wants to know whether the south to north water transfer project will bring about unintended consequences.
I'll have to take a first pop at it. 12 trillion gallons of water a year in the south to north irrigation system through three main irrigation processes. It's absolutely staggering. It is one of the largest infrastructure projects this planet has ever seen, no? Diverting the resources from the Tibetan Plateau to the North Plains in China means that the water that flow into the Irrawaddy, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, and other rivers is no longer available. And the consequences of that for the downstream, for the Mekong Delta countries and India itself are potentially very disruptive and profound. Yet to be seen exactly how this is going to play out, but you have a building of attention and a competition on a regional basis that looks very, very tense and threatening to our interests as well.
And to what extent do we worry about these water conflicts becoming, something more than a competition?
I mean, we said in the report, we thought, how did we phrase it? We thought in the next 10 years, we did not see conflict over water as likely, but beyond 10 years, it was increasingly plausible, I think is somewhat the way we phrased it. So we clearly observed in that report that water challenges between various states that share water have the potential of going to conflict in the future. And we also made the observation that nefarious actors would be trying to use water to their advantage. And sure enough, that has come true. We saw in Iraq, ISIL going after the Mosul Dam, and that was one of the things that shaped the way the United States and coalition partners responded to try and protect that water infrastructure. So yes, I think those are all possible.
So back to policy, Amy, many countries have got water subsidies, pricing water is very, very cheap, India, China, et cetera. Is this something you can see changing going forward, that we may come together around the importance of pricing things appropriately?
Well, one of the challenges with pricing water versus pricing carbon, say, is that water is a very local issue, and carbon, you emit greenhouse gas anywhere in the world, and the implication for the climate is the same. So you can have a global market. And so how a market functions and how effective it is will be so dependent on the local politics, the local economics, the local water structure, and even things like water footprints versus carbon footprints, deciding how much water is used for producing a pound of wheat or whatever, a barrel of wheat. So it's not clear that there should be uniformity on what the water footprint should be, because it's such a local issue. Mm-hmm. And so I don't see, while I'm a great proponent of pricing externalities in general, I don't see a water market, lots of distributed water marketing solving the water challenge. But I don't know if others agree with that.
The only thing I would add to that is the one thing I would say has been observed that we ought to really avoid is subsidizing water extraction from non-renewable sources.
Absolutely.
I mean, in some portions of the world, energy is subsidized so they can pump groundwater for agriculture.
Right.
Well, you're living on borrowed time.
Yeah.
That's not going to work long term. You're going to run out of water, and then you're going to run out of food, and that's going to be kind of an ugly set of circumstances. So, and that's probably the worst example of pricing exactly the wrong way.
So let me turn, because this makes me think of, I don't have a question on this, but I wish I'd had a question on deforestation. And let's sort of turn to Brazil for a moment. There's a place where national policies were so gung-ho on agribusiness, or expanding the agricultural industry, that a set of policies were put in place that, if I understand correctly, really led to greater deforestation. Say something about that, and what is Brazil's approach today?
Sure. So it's this great conundrum between the short-term interests of a country versus the long-term interests of the country, but also of the world. No, so there were many incentives. In fact, the military in the 1950s and 1960s said, we do not control our territory. And they built this extraordinary network of infrastructure to control the territory in Brazil. The roadways, canals, highways, railroads, a very complex system, militarily driven at that point in time, or at least that was the rationalization. From that flowed then the deforestation process that we all know about and study to great extent. But then the question is, in 2005, Brazil experienced a 100-year drought. 5 years later, it experienced the second 100-year drought. In 2011, less than normal rainfall. In 2012, less than normal rainfall. So all of a sudden, the changing of the hydrological cycles in that country is beginning to have an impact on the productivity of the agricultural sector. And so they are already projecting reduction in soy production of several percentage points because of these changes. So the question is, Brazil has done a rather remarkable accomplishments in observing, mapping the deforestation rate, trying to slow it down. Really, they deserve extraordinary credit for it. It is continuing, though at a lower rate. The question is, at what point will it actually recognize domestically that its interests are no longer being served by this kind of behavior, this policy, and actually realigning itself, I'll say, with the international community to say, this cannot continue.
Did you want to add anything, Amy, to that?
I mean, I think that the deforestation, getting back to the issue of sort of global and local, deforestation in that context, how you manage that is an interesting issue because it's sort of both in terms of it is a global issue. It can integrate into a global market of climate and carbon, and there's an effort to try to do that. But ultimately, it is these local issues that are so fundamentally driving decisions that it's hard to manage it. And the other challenge of that, of course, when you look at a global policy to manage a local issue is that you can solve that issue in one spot, but it's a global problem. And if it pops up somewhere else, then you think you've solved the problem, but you haven't. So in other words, the deforestation can decrease in one state of Brazil, but it's increased in Ecuador. And we are celebrating in Brazil, but as a globe, it hasn't made a difference. Mm-hmm. So this is the complexity of looking at the systems-based approach to these problems and the challenge of the realities of the dynamics of the national policies with managing Earth system processes, which is at a global scale.
So, sticking with this notion of a systems-based approach, or including the international system as we know it, and basically global governance, what came out of the September meeting? I had two different questions about this: the climate summit in New York in September, and what are you expecting will come from the Paris meeting?
I think there was momentum in spirit, let's say, towards this issue. I don't think that Paris will result in one all-encompassing new treaty that will be binding for all nations. I don't think it has to either. I think that, we've focused for a long time on solving the entire climate problem, avoiding 2 degrees. It's a very important milestone that we have to watch, and we don't want to cross. But the most important thing for us to do is to get on a path to lower emissions. And while we're talking about how we avoid 2 degrees, emissions keep going up. And so I think that if we're able to make smaller commitments and individual treaties that are focused on renewables, that are focused between certain countries, China and the US and India, and that gets us on a trajectory that's the right trajectory, that would be a huge success. And so I worry, that's why I'm not betting on Paris having a huge all-encompassing, and I'm also not going to be disappointed if it isn't, because I think the most important thing is for us to think holistically about getting on the right track. I think we've been really good about fighting one battle, to get carbon, not get the next ton of carbon go in the atmosphere, and trying to avoid 2 degrees. But somewhere in between, we have to think together, what we just need to do is get off fossil fuels. What we just need to do is stop deforestation. And we've actually done better on that one, thought systemically about that. It might not sound it, but I'm actually hopeful.
Can I just piggyback on what Amy said? I fundamentally agree with her. I think there's another interpretation of New York basically the president, driven basically by John Podesta in the White House, taken some extraordinary steps toward encouraging resilience and adaptation inside our country. At the same time, the Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, and speaking to the defense ministers in Peru, laid down a marker. He said, we are really committed to addressing this issue of climate change. So the supplement I'd like to add to what Amy said is, this really is a geostrategic negotiation with China. This is the G2. This is our putting down a marker and saying, we're going to hold you accountable. We've done it. Look what we've done in reducing our emissions and taking other measures. China, you got to get on board because we're coming after you.
And you can't expect India to get on board until those two are right.
Yeah,
So we have some questions that are more broad questions, and they're best for you, David, because they get to the heart of your book. One of the questioners notes that we've got some very fast-growing economies: Nigeria, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, and we would love to have their growth rates here, right? And so this questioner asks, what about prosperity without growth as the new economic model?
There's a strong current of thought in Europe of degrowth, and basically saying the future. So it is about new systems, new approaches, about renewables, and so forth. And I think, Amy, you were invoking a lot of that spirit to a certain degree. But by the same token, then, how that sounds very nice for the industrialized societies, but how do you address that for the developing countries where mass migration is looming, I think, unless these urgent needs are actually being addressed? And so there is an imperative to continue the developmental process and everything that we can do to support that, all the while trying to wean people off through incentives, through technology transfer, wean them off the consumption of carbon-based fuels. Yeah.
Can I just quickly respond to that? So I want to just make clear, though, I wasn't suggesting that the foreign policy for the coming age of renewables was about non-growth, because I actually think that we will need to, and we will learn to grow. And once we continue growth in an age of renewables, renewable energy, and a system that manages the resources, the goods and services of renewable resources such as water, food, and forest.
Yeah.
So it wasn't suggesting that we're going towards no growth.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
let me get one more audience question in here. Should note that the book includes very precise policy recommendations. This questioner asks, does your book offer recommendations about what we as individuals can do to increase emphasis on environmental security?
No, to be honest, I think I've sidestepped that question and basically tried to put it on a U.S. national policy level, looking at our development assistance program, looking at our approach exactly to climate change, and really having a very strong national energy policy. But it also says, and this is an area that I've really had the privilege of working with Rich and the National Intelligence Council, we need to establish a place, a hub is what we've called it, in our government that collects the evidence about these changes, that analyzes this evidence and says across our government, we have to respond in a coordinated way and set new priorities exactly in the context of a national security strategy. That is the one change, and we all need to begin to advocate for that, I believe.
So thank you, David Reed. Thank you, Amy Luers, and thank you, General Engel, for a really edifying evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.